Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Stitch Bliss Corner. Mari Rose here. Welcome to my subscribers. Thank you very much for doing that. I really appreciate that. And also, anyone who's visiting for the first time, welcome. I've had a little bit of trouble working out how to present Henry and his wives, because the subject is so vast. And I thought I'd just try to, once again, concentrate more on his character and the women in his life and what motivated him to do the things that he did. Because generally speaking, I think he not that he gets a raw deal, but I think he wasn't any more vengeful or mercenary than any other monarch of the time. That's my personal opinion. I think he did what he did because he thought that's what he had to do, to a degree. And I think later in his life he got manipulated quite a bit by the big, powerful, noble families around him who were vying for positions and everything. But anyway, I thought perhaps we could start with his parents and then work through, and then I go to pictures in the books that I have, and some details will probably come out then about the characters, rather than sit here and reel off a whole lot of facts and things. I mean, you can easily get those anyway off the internet these days. So anyway, I thought I'd just do a quick little summary. Now, Henry's parents, Henry VIII's parents, were Elizabeth of York and Henry VII. And this is a picture of these two here. Now, Henry had spent quite a few years in exile in Europe, waiting for the opportunity to come back to England and see if he could take the throne from the Yorkists. Now, Richard III took power, and I won't go into how he did all that because it's quite convoluted with doing Henry the VIII, not Henry the VII and Richard III. But anyway, on the Battle of Bosworth Field, Richard III lost the crown to Henry. Henry arrived at Milford Haven with a bunch of volunteers, supporters, and some mercenaries, and he wasn't really given much of a chance by people at the time that, observers. They didn't think he was going to win, but he managed to emerge victorious. And in order to cement his very tenuous hold on the throne at the time, he married Elizabeth of York, who was the heir to the throne, really. But in those days, a woman, they weren't going to tolerate, in England anyway, a woman on the throne. But this solved two problems. It solved what she could do, because if Henry didn't marry her, what was her future? It wasn't going to be very good, was it? Because she was a rival to him. So it was very pragmatic of her to marry Henry. And Henry, of course, mutually needed her. And according to quite a few historians, they loved each other as well. So that was good, because Henry really, he wanted peace for England too, because they'd had the Wars of the Roses for many years. And he had a plan. He had it all worked out in his head, how he was going to run England. He was an administrator. So anyway, Elizabeth and Henry had 4 children, and the oldest one was Arthur. So Henry's first thought when his son was born was who he could marry Arthur to from Europe that would cement Henry's position, as far as the dynasty went. So he settled on this girl, Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine's parents, Isabella and Ferdinand, he was the king of Aragon. And so really, Henry thought that was a great move. So she was married by proxy, and then she arrived in England. And she and Arthur were very young. I mean, I think Arthur was about 14. And they married, and he apparently the morning after came out of the chamber, the bedroom chamber, and said, you know, it was thirsty work, you know, get him a drink because last night he was in Spain or some such. And naturally enough, everyone felt that the marriage had been consummated. But then Arthur died not too long after the marriage. And Catherine always said that it wasn't consummated. And she stuck to that all her life. So then there was the problem of what to do with Catherine when when Arthur died. So his father, he sort of hummed and hawed for quite some time about what to do. And at the same time, his father now had to turn around and concentrate on Henry as being his heir. And Henry had really been prepared more for a church life, not for administrating a kingdom like Arthur had been. And so he was cut from a very different cloth to his brother. Henry was a big man, you know, grew up to be a big boy. He was about 6 foot. He had sort of blonde, reddish hair, and he was of big stature. And he loved physical activity, but his father wouldn't let him do anything like that because he was terribly worried that something would happen to him because, of course, the dynasty was what he was interested in. So until Henry's father died, Henry was quite, you know, mollycoddled. He was protected. But of course, as soon as his father died, Henry VII died, Henry was out there. He wanted to do everything. He was jousting, you know, having play sword fights, going on hunts, galloping over fields. He was just loving it. And in his exuberance, he decided to marry Catherine of Aragon. And they seemed to get on pretty well together. She was older than him, about 5 years older, but she was dutiful. She was very grateful that Henry married her, but at the same time she had quite a bit of pride herself. I mean, she was royal. I mean, it was logical that she should marry Henry as far as she was concerned. But they had to get a special dispensation to marry from the Pope because she had been married to Arthur, which Henry got, and that was okay. Now they waited then for the male child to come along, but unfortunately for Catherine, she was pregnant at least 8 times. She did have boys, but none of them survived. Only Mary survived, her daughter. Anyway, so they were married for 20 years. So Henry, he had mistresses, and Catherine tolerated them. She was okay in her own right. I mean, she brought Spanish blackwork to the English court. She was a great seamstress. Sewed Henry's shirts even after all the trouble with Anne Boleyn. She still sewed Henry's shirts. But I think Catherine was the sort of person that felt that sooner or later he'd come to his senses and come back to her. I think that was always her attitude. Keep on stitching and things would all come right. But unfortunately, they didn't come right. And meanwhile, Henry must have had his father's words ringing in his ears about having a son. He had to have a son, or else the dynasty would die. So one of his mistresses, Bessie Blount, actually did bear Henry a son. Henry Fitzroy. And secretly he was being prepared for kingship should anything happen to Henry, above and beyond Mary, the daughter of Catherine and Henry. But he died, so that didn't come to anything anyway. So anyway, we remember that Catherine of Aragon, when she first arrived in England, looked like this. And by the time she'd had all those pregnancies, all that heartbreak, all that disappointment, it started to show. And who should arrive as one of her ladies in waiting than this person, Anne. Now, Anne had, I'll just show that a bit longer. I mean, that's a very confident look, isn't it? She's going to put a bit of stick about, isn't she? You can see that. And anyway, Henry's eye fell on Anne. Now, Anne was brought up in Hever Castle in Kent, which I shall show you some pictures later. And she also travelled. She went to Holland, and she also went to the court of France. So she picked up a lot of customs, a lot of the chicness of the French court. And when she came back to England, she was seen as quite an exotic person. And there's another picture I'll show you of her that I think really shows her the passion that she incited in men, put it that way. And Henry, no sooner did he see her that he was absolutely smitten by her. Now, I think possibly Catherine thought, oh, this will just blow over, because Henry had already had an affair with Anne's older sister, Mary, not younger sister. That's in the movie, the latest film about Henry, and that's incorrect. In actual fact, Mary was the older one, and she was cast aside, and Anne thought, that's not going to happen to me. I am not going to be used and thrown aside. If Henry's going to have me, he's going to have me as his wife, or not at all. And of course, Henry, under normal circumstances, would have thought, oh, but he actually loved her. So he was in a bit of a pickle because he needed this male heir. Catherine was getting to the stage where she wasn't going to be having any more babies. So it came to a point, a political point, the point that for Henry was important to the realm, that he would have to somehow cast aside Catherine and marry Anne. So what he decided to do, Cardinal Wolsey was his advisor, and he said, look, go to the Pope and see if you can get the marriage annulled, because in the Bible it says you cannot uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife, and it shows that I've sinned because I haven't got a male child. And Wolsey thought, well, it's worth a shot. But the only problem there was that the Pope was under siege, and Catherine's relatives were in a powerful position. They were never going to allow the Pope to grant a divorce of any sort to Catherine, and Catherine was going nowhere. So then Henry thought, well, the only Cardinal Wolsey sort of lost his position over that, and a new advisor came along, and that was Thomas Cromwell, not Oliver Cromwell. He came a long time later. This is Thomas Cromwell. And Thomas was a lawyer, and he sat down and he said to Henry, well, look, if you decide, he said, are you a king or not? Because the Pope is telling you who you can be married to. So why don't you declare yourself as the leader of the church in England And then you can divorce who you like and you can marry who you like and never mind about what the Pope says. But Henry, of course, had a lot of mental anguish over this because he was a Catholic and he was quite religious. I mean, he was quite a devout person. He'd been called the defender of the faith at one stage, defending the Pope and all this sort of thing, the Catholic religion. But in the end, the practicality, the importance of providing an heir overcame Henry. And also, and this is where I want to read you part of what is written because I can't say it any better. This is from a book, The Queen of Subtleties by Susanna Dunn. And it's just someone in the back here is talking about Anne Boleyn. And it's just so beautifully written. And it says, she was born in the village of Blickling in Norfolk in the early 1500s, and so on and so forth. All the Boleyn men married aristocratic women. So Anne was well educated and well off. She spent her childhood in the idyllic surroundings of Hever Castle before being sent abroad to receive an elite education. First stop was the Netherlands and the household of Archduchess Margaret. Next came a long sojourn at the chic French court. Here she studied music. It was said that when she sang, like a second Orpheus, she would have made beasts and wolves attentive, and she polished up her language skills. She was intelligent, artistic, witty, and mesmerizing. Historian David Starkey records the reaction of a French courtier. She was beautiful, had an elegant figure, and eyes that were even more attractive. Such was their power that many men were hers to command. Anne returned to England in 1521. On 4th of March the following year, she made her first appearance at court at a masque. The king's sister represented beauty. Anne acted the roles of Perseverance and the Brunette. She won many admirers. Henry Percy was a rich nobleman, and Boleyn had a passionate, messy entanglement. 3 years later, it would be Henry VIII who was totally smitten. 17 letters from Henry to Anne survive in the Vatican archive. The 35-year-old, who had been king for 17 years and married to Catherine of Aragon for as long, moaned that he had been struck with the dart of love. He declared that he desired to take Anne as his sole mistress, to serve her and her alone. He sent her gifts, a costly bracelet, decorated with his portrait in miniature, arrived. A huge haunch of venison landed on her doorstep with the plea, "I send you this buck, killed late last night by my own hand, hoping that when you eat it, it will remind you of the hunter." According to Alison Weir, on Shrove Tuesday 1526, Henry attended a joust with the words "Declare not I" stitched onto his costly clothes. Above the words "A man's heart engulfed in flames" was embroidered. Mighty King Henry was wearing his heart on his sleeve, but Anne, unlike the other royal mistresses, Elizabeth Blount and her own sister Mary, had no intention of giving in easily. She sent Henry a letter and a present on New Year's Day. It was a sparkling diamond in the shape of a ship. In its prow was a storm-tossed, lonely maiden. The maiden was clearly Anne, and Henry was intended to be her safe harbour. Then it just says a little bit here about Catherine. Catherine herself would prove a worthy adversary. She was determined to stay married to Henry, declaring, "For each doctor or lawyer who might decide in your favour and against me, I shall find 1,000 to declare that the marriage is good and indissoluble." So clever and persuasive was Catherine that, according to Antonia Fraser, Anne berated Henry for trying to get the better of her, did I not tell you that whenever you argued with the Queen, she was sure to have the upper hand? So, in the end, Catherine died. And Anne then thought, well, sorry, backtrack a little bit. Anne, oh, no, I think it's in here. Sorry, there's just a little bit extra there, where she said something about an apple. Oh, the king declared that this was, she had an earlier conversation with the king and told him of her fearsome and unquenchable longing to eat an apple. The king had declared that this was a sign she might be pregnant. So, of course, what happened there was that Anne held out for years, 4 or 5 years, not letting Henry near her. And I think she started to think that he, as Catherine got older and the chances of her dying got closer, that he might turn his eye to someone else. So she did give in to Henry, and then, of course, played her ace, saying that she was pregnant, which she was. So Henry secretly married Anne, and then Catherine died. And Anne must have thought, because after she had Elizabeth, that was okay, but he wasn't happy because he thought he was going to have a boy. And of course it was Elizabeth. Now Anne got pregnant again, and the day that Catherine died, according to historical sources, Anne miscarried, and it was a male child. Well, Henry's patience ran out because Anne was quite a tempestuous and hot-headed person too. She was always carrying on about something. And I think by this time Henry had just had enough of the whole thing. He just wanted Anne gone. And he sort of said to Thomas Cromwell, what could we do? Well, I mean, before, if Henry had divorced Anne, then Catherine would still have been in the background. But now that Catherine was dead, Anne thought that, oh, I'm queen now, I'm sorted. But she wasn't sorted, because now it was easy. Henry could just get rid of Anne now, which is exactly what happened. Anne didn't last much longer than Catherine did. And Cromwell, he decided that they couldn't do this. They had to have a new way to divorce Anne. So then he trumped up all those charges of adultery with all these different men. I mean, it couldn't just be one. It was Francis Brereton. Then you had Henry Norris, who was the king's friend from childhood, her own brother George, and Mark Smeaton, an insignificant musician in the court. But of course they were all found guilty and killed and executed. And Anne, really, she had no defence anymore, because if they were guilty, well, obviously she was guilty. So the one bit of compassion that Henry did have was that he allowed Anne could have been burnt at the stake, but instead of that, he allowed a swordsman to come over from France to execute her. And she said, oh, I have but just a little neck. And if you watch Wolf Hall, which is a BBC production, there are 6 episodes. And although it has its moments where, you think, oh, a likely story, generally speaking, I think it has a refreshing look at Henry and Thomas Cromwell. It's more around Thomas Cromwell's life. But it's quite an interesting series, I should say. And the execution carried out on Anne in that particular series is particularly well done. I won't say any more than that about it. I don't want to spoil it for you if ever you do watch it. So anyway, Anne was now gone. Oh, as a little side thing, Anne had a tiny little extra piece of finger on her little finger. It was just stuck out a little bit. So she invented the Boleyn sleeves, and she had very long sleeves that hid this little birth aberration that she had. That's just an aside anyway. So after Anne, Jane Seymour came along. Now, Henry already had his eyes on Jane Seymour. She was one of Anne's ladies in waiting, and she was the opposite to Anne. She was modest and demure, but she had very powerful family behind her, the Seymours, and they wanted to see the Boleyns off the influential scale, and they wanted to replace the Boleyns. So Jane, I think Henry saw a lot of, well, she looks modest and demure and kind in her own way. So he married her, and she gave Henry the greatest joy because she gave him a son. The only problem was that after about 10 days, she died. And I think it's a bit, in those days when you were giving birth, in the time coming up to giving birth, you were shut in a room, all the light was shut out and everything for quite a few months before. And then you were confined to bed. Well, of course, that wasn't healthy because, you were going to get blood clots and all sorts of things. So she succumbed to that. He was absolutely bereft when she died. And for 2.5 years, he didn't look for anyone. But the court needed a queen because what were all the ladies in waiting going to do? It was a sort of an industry in itself. And the noble families were saying, he's got to find another wife. So Thomas More, I keep on saying Thomas More, I've got him on the brain. Thomas Cromwell, he decided that the best alliance that could be formed would be with a German princess because in France and Spain they were still Catholic, so they had a very powerful bloc. So Thomas Cromwell felt that Henry needed a powerful partner in Europe, and he thought of the German princes and everything. So then Anne of Cleves came along. Now, Holbein did a particularly kind, I'll show you later, picture of Anne of Cleves, and it's a front-on picture, and she looked really quite pretty, quite demure and fetching. But apparently, sideways on, she had quite a pointy nose. And Henry sent Holbein over to get a portrait. Well, of course, Holbein the younger this was. He got the portrait and came back. And Henry was enchanted with this picture. So he married her by proxy, I suppose you'd say. He hadn't seen her, put it that way. When she turned up, there was something about her that he didn't like. And she, poor girl, Henry turned up in disguise and she didn't know what was going on. So she didn't really know who he was. And at the same time, the minute he saw her, she just didn't do anything for him. So he was quite the gentleman about it, though. He just told people, look, I just don't fancy her. Can we get out of this attachment? And Thomas Cromwell said, well, not really, because it's really a very, in law, it's quite a strong marriage. So in the end, Anne of Cleves wasn't that keen on Henry either. I mean, she was a bit puzzled about everything. But the marriage was never consummated. And she decided that she would much rather go and live in the country somewhere on plenty of money. And Henry was very grateful that she went quietly. And the whole thing was forgotten. I think she was quite a friend to Mary and Elizabeth. And she was probably she was probably the most fortunate wife of the lot. The one that went off and did her own thing. So after that, now bear in mind now, Henry's getting old, he's got an ulcerated leg, he's pretty miserable. And the Boleyns want to exercise their power once again, because the Seymours now don't have the power because Jane Seymour died. So they put forward Catherine Howard, who was Anne's cousin. Now, little Catherine, Henry thought she was quite pure because she was so young. She was about 18 or 19. But it turned out that she'd had quite a colourful teenage time of it. She lived in the country and she'd had a couple of relationships with Derham was one of them and Mannix was another, these two guys. And when Henry married her, it was like she gave him an extra lease on life. He was happy and he went on a few hunts and this and that. But she was revolted by him. And she was young, and Thomas Culpeper used to dress the king's leg. And they took a liking to each other. And they started intimate relations. And Henry, people were coming to him telling him tales about what was going on, and he really didn't want to take any notice. But eventually he couldn't ignore it anymore, and poor old Catherine, she ended up being beheaded as well. And the legend goes that when she was arrested, the king's men came to take her, she went running down the gallery of Hampton Court, screaming, wanting to see the king. And he wasn't there or had just left or whatever. And she never got to see him. So, yes, quite tragic. So that was Catherine. Then we come, finally, to this lady, Catherine Parr. And she had already been married twice. Lady Latimer, her name was, when Henry turned his eye to her. And there was no pretense now for Henry. He just wanted someone to run the household, someone to wear the chatelaine, and someone that could give him some comfort. She'd been married twice before, and she was a motherly person. She mothered the children, she looked after them, and Henry was very comfortable in her company. But she did have enemies because she was a Protestant, and there were people that were always trying to tell Henry, you know, she's a dangerous woman, you shouldn't give her too much say in things, which she never did have much say in anything anyway. But she ended up outliving him. And when Henry first cast his eye on her, she was actually in love with Thomas Seymour. And Thomas Seymour said, look, marry Henry, and then when he dies, I will marry you then. But I'm not going to go near you if Henry wants you. That's not an option. So when Henry died, she did marry Thomas Seymour, but he was a very ambitious man. And that's another story again, I won't get into that. Right, so there's a picture of Henry as he got a bit older. In old age. So I think now I will just go through some pictures and then I will show you my stitching, because I actually have a picture that I did of Henry. All right, so I'm just going through these. Now here's a little story. Remember I mentioned Henry VII had a daughter Mary. Well, she married Louis XII of France, who was a very old man. That's him. Well, he looks young there, but he was quite old when she married him. And she was in love with someone else when she married him. She was in love with Charles Brandon. Now, Henry VIII sent Charles Brandon to go and get Mary from France when Louis died. That was a mistake on Henry's side because they secretly got married because she didn't want Henry marrying her to anyone else. And there they are. Love conquered all in the end. And I think that's rather lovely. And I don't know why the filmmakers don't cover that story because it's rather wonderful in the end. Now here's the picture I was telling you about the Anne Boleyn and just how sexy he must have found her. There he is, the great prince of the Renaissance. And you can just imagine when he clapped his eyes on this one. No wonder he was so enchanted by her. And she was very assertive as well. There was nothing servile about Anne at all. Now, there's Anne's sister Mary. That's the one he had the affair with, that he cast aside. And she ended up marrying, who was it? William Stafford in the end, and away from court. She lived away from court. Now, here's Henry again, and here's Jane Seymour, the one that his most beloved, according to him. And this is from the book, the all-colour book of Henry VIII. Yes, there's Thomas Cromwell, the fixer. He sorted everything for Henry. And he fell foul of Henry after the Anne of Cleves episode. Henry executed him. And within months, he was saying how he never, ever should have done that because he was such a good administrator. Now, here's the enchanting picture of Anne of Cleves that Hans Holbein the Younger painted and brought back to Henry. And that was Henry at the time. Henry forgave Hans Holbein because he said he had the artist's eye and he saw beauty where maybe there wasn't any. But a lot of the people at the time thought she was quite attractive. And there's a self-portrait of Hans Holbein the Younger. And just look at he did a lot of portraits in the court. Look at the way that man's swashbuckling along. This is one of the courtiers. There's Hever Castle, where Anne spent her childhood. And there is the King's Jester. What's his name? Somers, I think it was. Yeah, Will Somers was the King's Jester. And here's the tragic Catherine Howard. Henry called her his rose without a thorn. Right. Then we come to another picture of Catherine Parr. And there's a picture of Henry corresponding. All these are corresponding to the same age as he was when he met and married these women which is really good. This book is excellent for that. Now here, I've just got something to show you here. Quite interesting. There is Henry's armour when he was about 21. This is from The Medieval Knight by Brooks Robards. But anyway, just keep that in your head. And here is Henry's armour when he reached middle age. And probably it would have needed to be even bigger than that when he got older. Because, of course, he was, as I said, he was a very active man. And you can imagine this huge 6-foot, golden-haired king swaggering around the court. And one day he went to a joust and a horse fell on him. And people thought he was dead because it took him quite a long time to come round. And he must have received quite crushing injuries inside that took a while to heal and everything. And his leg, he got a very bad ulcer on it. And of course he couldn't move around as much. And he just put on weight. And here's Henry's 3 children. Edward and Mary. And you can sort of see the hard life Mary's had there in that picture. But her mother would never have had that marriage annulled because she was never, Catherine of Aragon was never going to disinherit her daughter. Never in a million years. And there's Thomas Seymour, the very ambitious man I was talking about. Okay, so that's that book. Then it wouldn't be complete to talk about Henry and his life without mentioning Francis I of France. Now he was Henry's great rival, and the thing with, and I think that was one of the reasons that Henry was so desperate to have a son, because he'd gone through all that divorcing Catherine to marry Anne to get the son, and Anne didn't produce a son. And I think he was thinking that this particular person, till I find him, see, he's further in the book, that's why it's a bit difficult. He would have been, as far as Henry is concerned, this one had sons. The King of France had sons. And I'm sure Henry thought to himself, he'll be laughing his socks off at me because I've gone to all this trouble and I still haven't got a son, and he's got sons. And I think that was another thing in the background that was rattling around in Henry's brain, that his great rival, because apparently Francis I had calves that were the same size as Henry's calves. And in those days, the calves of a man were very important as far as manliness and all the rest, and prowess and sexual fervour and all this sort of thing. And Francis, not only did he have calves the same size, but he had sons. So Henry must have just been beside himself. And there's the comparison, of course, of Henry and Francis. He's on the cover anyway. So you can imagine the rivalry between those two. So he must have been very relieved when he got his boy in the end, Henry. Right, so then I have this book here. Sorry, I should have said who this was by. Desmond Seward, Prince of the Renaissance. He was the father of Henry II, who got the jousting pole through the eye. The father of Francis, who married Mary, Queen of Scots. just for the ones that saw the Mary Queen of Scots. Right, so just a few more little bits and pieces here, just to go through. Oh, here's Henry VIII's writing desk, where he probably wrote a few of those love letters to Anne. That's Catherine's. All right, I think these are pictures of the wives. I'll just show you if there are any that are different. Oh, this is of interest here because Henry had a portrait painted, and this is after Jane Seymour has passed away, but that's his family portrait of Jane and his son. And he would have been married to someone else when he had that picture painted. I'm just doubling up. Oh, you might just like to see Edward, Henry's son. And I suppose really fate was kind to Henry in one aspect, and that is that his son was still alive when Henry died. So he didn't know that his son would die, and the kingdom would be left to women. Mary first, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, and then the splendid reign of Elizabeth came after that. And that's yet another story, Elizabeth's story. Well, there are probably things that I've forgotten in that, but you can't remember everything. Now, remember, I mentioned in a previous video that a friend gave me some parts of a magazine, New Stitches, that had the Tudor dynasty in it. And this one was the one that I stitched. And for once, I am not feeling bad about going overboard with the sparklies. Because as far as I'm concerned, Henry was a sparkly. So here he is. You can see his fine calves, which modern rendition, I mean, I'm sure the modern actors say, look, don't put me in tights or else I won't be playing Henry. So they tend to put him in, you know, leather things and big long boots and things now. But in those days, it was considered the height of masculinity to be showing off your legs. And here he is. And he's glistening quite a bit there. I don't think I've got a... No, I haven't got any beads. But this was done in the 90s, I think, by me. He's just been sitting there all that time, rolled up in storage. So, there he is. And then I've just got one more thing. What did I put here? Yes, now there is a film called, I think it's called The Other Boleyn Girl or something like that. And it's got some inaccuracies in it. And you expect that. You expect poetic license to a degree. But in that particular film, Henry violates Anne. And there is no record whatsoever that Henry ever did anything violent like that towards a woman. In fact, Anne was the one that lured Henry in the end, because she was worried about his eye going elsewhere. So I think that's not fair. You know, I mean, history can be, I think you can play with the edges of history, but I think it's not fair to change history to make someone look a way that they're not. I don't think that's fair. So I'm going to say that in Henry's defence. Now the other thing here is just this last little bit here. This is called The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger. And if you're wondering what that is, in the bottom there, I will show you. Let's get my infamous iPad here. see if it's behaving itself today. I mean, I shouldn't malign it because it's an older one and it's done me good service. That there at the bottom is that. It's a skull. But you have to stand a certain way in front of the painting to see it. And it's got here an anamorphic skull. This is from Wikipedia. The most notable and famous, I'll just hold this up while I'm reading this to you. The most notable and famous of Holbein's symbols in the work, however, is the distorted skull which is placed in the bottom centre of the composition. The skull, rendered in anamorphic perspective, another invention of the early Renaissance, is meant to be a visual puzzle, as the viewer must approach the painting nearly from high on the right side or low on the left side to see the form as an accurate rendering of a human skull. While the skull is evidently intended as a memento mori, it is unclear why Holbein gave it such prominence in this painting. One possibility is that this painting represents three levels: the heavens, as portrayed by the astrolabe and other objects on the upper shelf, the living world, as evidenced by books and a musical instrument on the lower shelf, and death, signified by the skull. It has also been hypothesized that the painting is meant to hang in a stairwell, so that persons walking up the stairs and passing the painting on their left would be startled by the appearance of the skull. A further possibility is that Holbein simply wished to show off his ability with the technique in order to secure future commissions. And I think Henry, you know how I said he forgave Holbein for painting Anne of Cleves the way he did. I think that was pragmatic of Henry as well, because he needed his court photographer to do paintings. He couldn't do without Holbein. So anyway, there's the skull again. And I just don't know. I mean, when you Google it, the ambassadors, and you can actually see they do the angle so you can see the skull. So if you get the chance, I mean, I've sort of can't really get it. Oh, maybe there it looks a bit like a skull. Yeah, you have to get right sideways on. And people, when it's on display in London from time to time, people go there with, that's their goal, to go and see this painting so they can go and stand in that spot and see the skull in perspective. Right. Well, I think that's all for this, well, gosh, 53 minutes, 54 minutes. I hope that I've managed to paint a little bit of a portrait of what Henry's life must have been like. How odd it must have been to wake up one day a noble and with all this influence, and the next thing you know, you're in a dungeon waiting to be killed. I mean, it's mind-blowing, really, isn't it? So maybe a quiet little life in the country somewhere. If you could get, you know, crops to grow and tucked out of sight somewhere, might have been the best way to live in Tudor times than living at the high table. There's a price to pay to be at that high table. Anyway, thank you if you've lasted this long. Love to have you along, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Bye for now.